My talk is indeed titled, Taking a Mulligan, New Policies in Search of Appropriate Problems. If there are golfers in the room, you will know that taking a mulligan is taking a second swing at the ball. Okay? It means deciding your first swing was unsatisfactory. And in golf, you're supposed to count only the swings you take. You're not supposed to be able to do something twice. The idea here is a do-over. Okay? And I'm titling this New Policies in Search of Appropriate Problems because, to tip my hand, I think that the policies have been advanced not to address the problems that the government has identified, but instead to address another set of problems. Okay? And I'm going to try to articulate them and also explain why I think the policies proposed are not going to solve the problems. In fact, they're going to worsen them. So we had a lot of really excellent academic presentations today. I'm going to front load my talk with a bitter academic pill. I'm going to quote from Ernest Gellner, the theoretician of nationalism, who famously described the national principle, the idea that the cultural unit and the political unit should be congruent. And where they're not, nationalists are likely to be disturbed and seek to fix the problem. He says, and I quote here, "A territorial political unit can only become ethnically homogeneous if it either kills or expels or assimilates all non-nationals. Their unwillingness to suffer such fates may make the peaceful implementation of the nationalist principle difficult. In other words, the people who are the target of such homogenization are likely to get in the way of the problem." Here is the simplest formulation of my argument. There are no homogeneous polities in the world. So Gellner is describing a chimera. Yet many states have sought to make that chimera a reality, and the Chinese state now seems to be aiming to do a more thorough job of this than it never has before. The historian Jim Millward has taught many of us about the importance of Qing conquest and the Qing imperial configuration. The Qing conquered large new territories and a large number of culturally distinct peoples, including Turkey Muslims, Mongol, and Tibetan Buddhists. There was a debate in the late Qing among Chinese, that is, anti-Manchu nationalists, about whether to keep the territories and peoples in a future China. This was the position of Yang Xizhang. Or rather to jettison them and to return to Ming borders with presumably pure Chinese populations. This was the position of Yang Bing. The inclusivist view won out, and the PRC, decades later, successfully maintained most of the Qing colonies and their culturally distinct populations, along with the Ming territory and its Han majority. The Chinese Communist Party's policies developed to manage non-Hans beginning in the late 1940s, even before the communist victory in 1949, followed the Soviet model, acknowledging cultural difference and according special, if modest, political rights to culturally distinct groups. The long-term aim was to bring about a slow fusion of the peoples into one people. The resulting system was much less, it should be said, than Uyghurs and Tibetans and Mongols wanted, and much less than Mongols had enjoyed briefly from 1947 to 1949. And it was much more than many other non-Han groups had aspired to. As Drew Gladney pointed out years ago, the system identified 50-odd non-Han groups as ontologically equivalent, as means with the same special cultural political rights. He called this pearls on a string. I think it's a very nice metaphor. June Tufel-Dreyer pointed out in her excellent 1976 book, China's 40 Millions, a fundamental tension in both the Soviet and Chinese systems. On the one hand, recognizing cultural difference and promoting the flowering of each culture. And on the other hand, seeking to reduce cultural difference and promote a single, embracing culture. They were in tension, she said. And this tension would never be resolved with the set of policies adopted. I want to suggest that the new policies advocated in China for nearly a decade now, and more recently, first by scholars and more recently by policy advisors and government officials, are intended to resolve the tension by abandoning the first goal, by abandoning the promotion of cultural flowering, protection of cultural difference for various peoples. This, of course, has direct implication for Uyghurs inside the territory and observers outside. The aim is to bring about greater uniformity in language, religious practice, dress, fertility, and thus engineer, and I use this word quite intentionally, engineer uniform identification, or ren, with the Chinese nation. I want to suggest that these scholars and advocates naively, or perhaps dishonestly, assume that wanting homogeneity and using policies to promote homogeneity somehow make that homogeneity possible. Furthermore, and crucially, they do not address the causes of the recent violence in Xinjiang, or the much more widespread dissatisfaction among Uyghurs, and I would add Tibetans. Instead, they exacerbate them. So the supposed problems at root, we could start with the work of Mao Rong, a professor at Beijing University, who says that China should adopt the melting pot model of the United States. Or Hu Angang, who more recently proposed what he called second-generation policies toward non-Hans in China. And still more recently, Zhu Weiqun, the former head of the United Front Work Department in China. In the view of these folks, religiosity, religious belief and practice, is a problem in itself. Reliance on non-Chinese languages and a lack of interest or fluency in Chinese keep the various Minzu isolated from each other and cut off from the Chinese economy. Minzu identification itself and religiosity and linguistic differences leave the various non-Han groups or Minzu feeling alienated from the Chinese nation. Ma Rong said, the policies adopted by the communists in '49 broke a healthy Chinese tradition of assimilating peoples over the very long term, a pre-revolutionary tradition. Improperly applied the Soviet system, which both perpetuated differences and actually sharpened them. They argue China needs a unified nation in order to ease the government's security concerns and worries about disintegration. I want to suggest that, in fact, the recent critiques of existing policies by people like Ma Rong and Hu Angang seem to refer to a problem affecting all the pearls on the string, all the Minzu in China. But in fact, they clearly address principally two groups, Uyghurs and Tibetans. So this is where my general talk on policy is appropriate for a conference on Uyghurs. Among other things, these folks have proposed which means nation or nationality, and is sometimes also translated ethnicity in Chinese. Jettisoning the word for any group except the Zhonghua Minzu that Jim Edwards spoke about this morning, the Chinese nation. Ending recognition of Minzu status for minorities and taking that category off of identification cards. Replacing the term Minzu, describing these peoples, with the word Zuquan, which emerged in Taiwan to describe ethnicity. It's downgrading the status of these peoples, you might say. And promoting, through various means, economic, linguistic, and social integration of these peoples into China. I want to point out that, though these are new initiatives, R.A. Dwyer has already nicely pointed out that in the linguistic field, this increasingly compulsory integration is well underway. But in other aspects, the government, I think, intends to enact more strongly and unambiguously assimilationist policies. I want to return to the topic of dialogue raised by Drew and raised with me by a member of the audience today. It's not only important, I think, but perhaps indispensable to have an actual dialogue that includes Chinese interlocutors, Chinese speakers. But I want to suggest that there is a pathology, a problem inside the party, an unwillingness to publicize difference and debate inside the party. And scholars in China, willingly or not, work under scrutiny from the party, and they know they can be silenced, even dismissed. And as the case of our unfortunate friend and colleague Ilham has recently demonstrated, they can even be imprisoned for the crime of speaking out of turn. If the organizers of this conference had sought to have a scholar representing the party's views attend, Beijing probably would have blocked that scholar's participation. Why? Because it takes great pains not to confer legitimacy on international discussions of its policies, or acknowledge the right of these participants to join in policy debates. Look at the treatment, for instance, of Jordan as the Dalai Lama, Rabbi Khan, and others such influential figures. Now, on the other hand, if the organizers had invited a critic, even a loyal critic, of the policy changes proposed by Mao, Guangdong, and these others, that person would have had to fear costs for participating in this conference. Right? So it's unlikely the first time scholar would have been allowed to come. The second time scholar would have been very afraid to come. So I don't think it's an accident that that set of scholarly voices is missing from this conference. That's my own view, by the way. But I do want to move on to say there is a modest policy debate inside China. This is not, I'm not telling you, a story about Chinese all thinking with one mind about the national question, what the Chinese call Minzu, which they got from Nationalny Voпрос in Russia. A number of academic critics of these scholars and policymakers have emerged, spoken out, and published on the topic. Most of them take the position that the party's existing policies are good. They just need to be better implemented. I want particularly to commend to your attention the work of Zhang Haiyang, a scholar at the same institution where Zhang used to teach, who does this, defends the party's existing policies, and a lot more. He points out that Mao Zedong's history of Chinese policy that suggests until 1949 this trans-historical China was always assimilationist. This is a very nearsighted view of Chinese history. In fact, the strongly assimilationist policies that Mao advocates were really implemented only in the Republican era by the Kuomintang, by the Nationalist Party. The communist policies developed in the 1940s, says Zhang Haiyang, drew not only on the Soviet example, but also on that of the Qing Empire before. This is another point that Jim Miller has nicely made. Zhang Haiyang particularly mocks the assimilationists with a parable in one of his articles. It's a very funny parable. You need to understand that in China there are villages where people all have one surname. So it could be called Wang Jiacuan, the village where everyone's named Wang. And then other villages have multiple surnames. So he tells a parable in which the inhabitants in a multiple surname village, a village with multiple family names, travel to other villages and they discover there are single surname villages. And they find them wonderful. Then they go home and insist that their villages tear up the village compact that allowed these multiple surnames. They force all villagers to adopt a single surname and that family's family tree, customs, and so forth. In his parable, he says, when this was implemented, it destroyed the formerly balanced and harmonious relations in the village. These are, of course, sardonic references to the language of harmonious society by Hu Jintao. Concluding his own very funny parable, Zhang questions the reference value of villages like the India village and so forth, which are reported in the article, and the story of the collapse of the Soviet village. Going on to note that Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan villages are all successfully carrying out one village, two systems, without disintegration. This is a reference to equal damage, one country, two systems. After delivering his comic jabs, Zhang continues with deadly serious criticisms, condemning Guangdong's second-generation policies as a Minzu great leap forward, one of the worst disastrous periods in modern Chinese history, or a redeployment of concentration camp logic. This is something he published in a Chinese journal. It's important to note. Let me also point out that I found, when doing the research for the first version of this paper, an amazing thing on the website of the Minwei, the Committee for the Management of Minzu Affairs in China. It is, in fact, a web page where you can click on arguments pro and con these new policies. Okay? You can click and you can read, including Zhang Haiyang's articles. Okay? So I'm not suggesting that these somewhat dissenting voices are silenced or marginalized. What's remarkable to me is there is no other policy realm I'm aware of in which the party has permitted someone to put up a page inviting people to think about pro and con. Right? And when I first saw this, I was puzzled. Why would they do this? I think that they were hoping to elicit some chatter on the web about these alternatives. A kind of what I call virtual plebiscite. Get people talking and canvass opinion. Now what happens when the 92% of the population of China that are Han Chinese consider policies that give special privileges to minorities? What are the majority of that majority likely to say about this policy? I think you can guess for yourselves. And therefore, a virtual plebiscite is likely to be rather lopsided. Let us consider now the possibility that these more frankly assimilationist policies will be implemented in China. I think the likelihood is greater given the violence of the last few years in Xinjiang and also in Tibet. And indeed, Ma Rong and Huang Gang have openly suggested that this violence lends these suggestions greater urgency. They've even suggested that these justify the search for new solutions. As has been observed this morning, the violence also gives Beijing a freer hand to act under the guise of fighting global terror and separatism. Furthermore, as I just suggested, many Han Chinese feel that the affirmative action policies are unfair and have had only pernicious, harmful effects. We could note a similar backlash against affirmative action policies among Americans of European descent in the United States, so this is not unique to China. I want to point out further that the Xi administration has been bold in various ways. It's been unafraid to prosecute high officials for corruption, which I think really was a matter of factional infighting, and thus to rattle many other high officials in China. At the same time, I think, the Xi administration has shown itself profoundly fearful that it may not be able to maintain order in the country. The violence in Xinjiang and Tibet invites Chinese citizens to conclude that Xi perhaps is not in full control of the situation. And I see many of the recent moves by the Xi administration as signs not of confidence, but of extreme insecurity. Let us note, I didn't speak previously about religion policy because they don't spend too much time in the text talking about religion. But very obviously, since they are targeting Uyghurs and Tibetans for assimilation, there's great attention paid to religious practice in Tibet and Xinjiang. Hence the emphasis on how monks may worship, which temples are open, and so forth. Whether Uyghur women may wear headscarves, whether Uyghur men may have beards. Project Beauty, the increasingly strong push to prevent people from observing Ramadan fast, and so on. These are clear signs that the government is really trying to force changes in religiosity, or at least their outward manifestations. I want to suggest tying my talk back to the lamentable, disastrous developments of the last few days. The targeting and sentencing of Ilham Tohti is awful in itself, but it's a disturbing sign of the party's position. It suggests that people can be imprisoned for their speech and writings, but not only that, also for the events that the party decides have resulted from their speech and writings, because after all, he's being blamed for the violence that occurred in Xinjiang on several occasions, as if somehow he spoke and they came and did the violence. Xinhua published an account, it's not a transcript by any means, an account of the trial itself. I found this rather extraordinary, and in it, a special Kunlun scholar at Xinjiang Pedagogical University was quoted, a fellow named Liu Bing, who I think is a mouthpiece here, saying that terrorist action is bad enough, but promoting and inciting violence is still worse. Thus, China must target not just violent terrorist actions, but separatist thought in the ideological sphere. It is necessary, he said, to purify the podium, that is to say, clean out dirty voices from the place where people speak from. And he concludes, a second Ilham Tohti can absolutely not be allowed to exist. I find this language utterly chilling and symptomatic. And note, please, that this is an intellectual who is presumably knowledgeable about the real situation in Xinjiang. He is being given the authority to speak about the party's behaviors. I'm coming to my conclusion. I think the likely outcomes of the policies that have been proposed, and to some extent already begun to be implemented, of course, increased Han immigration, with particular incentives to move into southern Xinjiang, where Uyghurs still predominate. Years ago, the scholar Ma Dazhang called this filling out the circle of populations that surround the Uyghur populations in the south. The result, of course, will be increasing cultural and economic pressures on the Uyghurs still living there. I think this will increase Uyghur concerns about forced assimilation in various ways, the loss of their culture, and the elimination of their last space for difference. I think this will lead to a correct fear of the loss of the last tiny space for political protections from national policies. And I think there's an especial concern about greater pressure on religious practice, although I find myself boggling to try to think how much worse it could get in the world of religious policy. I think as a consequence of the discussion of these policies and the uptake in more forcibly assimilationist policies, apocalyptic rumors are more likely to be widely believed in Xinjiang, even worse visions of what's to come. That people who were already near the limits of their tolerance will become more desperate and more likely to act on their desperation. Thus, I think such policies would deepen and widen discontent and increase instability in the region, instead of promoting the greater unity and stability promised by the likes of Mao and Guangdong. Thank you very much.